Stridente meets Graham Dowdall.
My grandfather in Scotland was a church organist and choir master, and so there was always music around us. And I was a boy soprano. I was a very good singer when I was very young. First record I bought at the age of 9 was All the Day and All the Night by the Kinks. And so that was a big influence on me. But in a way, musically, a bigger influence was sound in a general sense. We had this radio at home, which was called a portable radio. It was this big, and the battery weighed about 8 kilos. It was enormous. I had to go in like that. And I would sit on the kitchen floor with this radio, just dialing round all these weird, strange stations. And even more interestingly, the sounds in between the stations, the short wave, the long wave. And from the age of about 4, I was just entranced with this, just dialing round and finding out all this stuff. And so I think more than anything, it's playing with the radio that's really influenced me throughout my life. And I remember lying in bed in the dark, listening to John Peel on the radio, and this band came on. And it was purely electronic sound. And I turned the light on and I got my diary and I wrote the name of the band in the diary so I'd never forget it. Kraftwerk Band. And so I just loved that stuff. And I also was exposed on the radio to more kind of avant-garde electronic classical music as well, which I also loved. So pulling those things together was what created my tastes and my musical interests, really, yeah. As I say, I was a singer, but I always experimented with sound, and I was drawn to play the drums from a very early age. I used to play biscuit tin, cardboard boxes, stuff like that. And then at the age of 10, I was given a Ringo Starr plastic snare drum for my Christmas. Ringo Starr being the drummer in the Beatles. And so I just started to play, really, and just kept playing. And of course, when you're a boy soprano, your voice breaks at around the age of 13. So instead of having this beautiful sound, you have a really gruff sound. And so I kind of gave up singing and went very much into the drumming. Even though my music teacher at my primary school said to me when I told her I wanted to be a drummer, she said, "You're too musical to play the drums." Even then I thought it was a bit of an insult, but you know, anti-drummer jokes in the early 60s, yeah. To begin with, I'd just play at home, and then at about the age of 14, 15, we decided to make a band with some friends, and I had the drum, so I became the drummer. And the band was called Halifax, after the town in the north of England. And like everybody at 15, we started doing a few covers, other people's songs, and realised we didn't like doing that. So we just started to make stuff up. And we got more and more experimental. We had a very early synth player. One of the guys in the band who was the guitarist, his dad worked for the BBC as an electronics engineer. And so he built him a modular synthesizer in 1971 when no one had synthesizers. So it started with tone generators and ring modulators, and then it got put into a box. One day, our music teacher had bought a very early 4-track tape recorder, and he didn't really know how to use it. So he gave 3 of us who were in the band and also at school together the tape recorder, an editing block for cutting up tape, a book of Stockhausen scores, and a key to the instrument cupboard. And he said, "Come back to me at the end of term with something." So we were making tape loops. We were doing backwards recordings at the age of 16, 17. So there was no way back from there, really, you know, it was only going to be forwards. I didn't believe that there was a career for me in music because I have no training. And at that point, it was like either you're going to be a pop star or you're not going to do anything with music. You know, there wasn't really much in between, it seemed. And I was very political. And our careers teacher at school said, "You're such a political, argumentative person, you should go and become a radical lawyer." So I did a degree in law, mid-70s, and then came out of that and worked in a local law centre giving free legal advice and representing black young people who were being oppressed by the police. And so that took up the sort of second half of the 70s, even though I was still doing music on the side, really, but not professionally. And then we were made redundant. The Conservative Council closed the law centre, took away our funding at the beginning of 1980. And I'd been doing increasingly more music while I was working as a lawyer. I was working with a theatre group called Abracadabra, and we were doing street performance across Europe, where I was basically doing free improvisation alongside a clown and a juggler and a fire eater and stuff like that. So that became a bit of a job. And then I was doing free jazz as well, just playing pure free stuff on my own at the London Musicians Collective, which used to be in Camden. And one day I was doing an improv and there were two people in the audience, very differently dressed. They were like long coats, that very kind of post-punk look. And after I finished, they came up to me and they said, "Oh, we really like the way you play. We have a band in Manchester. We'd like you to join the band." And the band was a band called Ludus. And so I went up to Manchester a couple of weeks later to play with Ludus. And Manchester was really exciting in the early 80s, much more so than London in a lot of ways. So I joined Ludus, and a funny little story attached to that. The day I went to join Ludus, I went to their house and the door was answered by this rather nerdy guy with high hair and glasses. And he said, "Hello, my name's Stephen. The band aren't here yet. I'll come in, let's have a cup of tea." And we sat and chatted. And this young man had written a book about the New York Dolls. And this young man was Stephen Morrissey, who went on to be Morrissey from the Smiths. And he was our greatest supporter of Ludus. He would make tea at rehearsals. He would announce us on stage. And yeah, he was our biggest supporter. And so I started to play with Ludus and got into that scene in Manchester. And the first gig I ever did with Ludus actually was in London, was supporting the Psychedelic Furs with the Thompson Twins on the bottom of the bill. And then the second gig I did with Ludus was supporting Depeche Mode when they were number one with Just Can't Get Enough. They were releasing records on a label called New Hormones, which was funded by the Buzzcocks from Manchester, who it was their label. And so I worked with them for about 18 months and then something happened. I've never really got to the bottom of it, and I was sacked after our best and biggest gig. We did a big festival called Futurama, and the next day they stuck a note through the door of where I was staying, sacking me. So I was heartbroken because I loved the band and we were really starting to get somewhere. Next day, the phone just started ringing. And amongst the people ringing me was a friend, Eric Random from Manchester, to ask me if I'd work with him. He was a good friend of Cabaret Voltaire. He formed a band called the Bedlamites, Eric Random and the Bedlamites. And we did quite a lot of recording at Western Works, which was Cabaret Voltaire's studio. And start a band with a chap called John Mackay, who was the first guitarist in Susie and the Banshees. We did a short tours of Europe and we put out a couple of records, but it never really developed a momentum because John had a bad reputation in the music industry because he had quit the Banshees in the middle of their success. So he was kind of blacklisted. And I think that stopped the band ever getting properly signed. And then was a promoter and manager, a guy called Alan Wise, who said, "Oh, I've got this singer here, this German singer, who's decided to stay in Manchester, and she's asked me to form a band around her, and we think you'd be the perfect drummer." And that was Nico from the Velvet Underground. And we went to a very scuzzy, very scruffy rehearsal studio in North Manchester. I walked in and there was Nico, and she's quite intimidating to look at. And the microphone was broken, the PA was broken. But Nico just started to sing with no microphone. When she started to sing, every hair on my body just stood on end. And it was like, oh my God, this sound is just incredible. So we got on. Nico and I hit it off like that. And so I spent on and off the next 7 years working with Nico. On and off because she was a heroin addict and things got messy at times, and some of the gigs weren't paid and some of the tours didn't work. So I would regularly quit, saying, look, I can't deal with this, it's too much of a mess. And then a few months later, I get this phone call, oh, dudes, it's Nico here. We really want you to join. Everything's much better again. And so I'd join up again until it went wrong, and then I'd join up, and just went on like that. We did a studio album in 1985 called Camera Obscura, where the producer was John Cale. And then the next year I did an album where I played on John's own album, Artificial Intelligence. We did a fantastic gig at the Berlin Planetarium, and that was in Berlin, which was Nico's hometown where she was born. And so we performed that gig, and it was beautiful because Nico had given up the heroin. She was very healthy. And then sadly that year she fell off her bicycle in Ibiza and had a brain hemorrhage and died. And obviously that was traumatic. She was my friend as well as my colleague. In 1991, I set up a band called Sonic Zuno, which was basically a duo with a singer called Sharon. And we made kind of dance pop, really, I suppose, techno pop, I suppose you'd call it, and had a couple of reasonably successful 12-inch vinyl white labels. So on one side, I was doing kind of electro pop. On the other side, I was working in a very avant-garde band called Infidel. And we toured Russia, and we played in deepest Siberia at a shamanist music festival in 1993. The singer in that band was also a manager at that time, and one of the acts he managed was the Band of Holy Joy, and another act that he managed was Pere Ubu. And so somewhere in the late 90s, I got a call from Nick to say that David Thomas had a side project called the Pale Boys. And at that point, it involved Keith on guitar and Andy Diagram on trumpet. And Andy couldn't do a short tour. So Nick rang me up and said, look, do you want to replace Andy on this tour? I said, well, I don't play the trumpet. He said, no, that's okay. That doesn't matter. Meet David. David was at the Water Rats, King's Cross. So I met David there. And I said, look, David, I don't play the trumpet. He said, I don't care what you do. I've heard that what you do is good. That's all that matters. So I said, okay. So we went off with no rehearsal, with nothing. We never played together. We just went off and did a tour of Holland the next week. And it was tense. David was in those days very moody and could be very difficult, but he and I just hit it off. And we've been good friends ever since, really. And so initially I decked for Andy, then Andy came back. So David said, oh, I still want to work with you. Will you do the sound? I said, I don't do live sound. He said, no, but you make good records. I said, yes. He said, well, you can do live sound. So I did live sound for a while for the Pale Boys. Then he asked me to do live sound for Pere Ubu. And then one day he rang me up and he said, I did. So I said, I'm afraid I've got to sack you as sound man. I said, oh, okay. Because I want you to join the band. From then on, I've kind of worked either with David on the side projects, the Pale Boys, or as a kind of originally an extra member of Pere Ubu, a kind of additional member. And then for the last 7 or 8 years as a core member of Pere Ubu, yeah. We would do some pretty hard tours, so it's sometimes hard to recall where you went, because we would do maybe 25 gigs in 26 days in 8 different countries. It was that kind of schedule, really. So it would be, it's Thursday, oh, we must be in Italy. Oh, it's Friday, we must be in Slovenia. It's, you know, it was like that. I've played maybe half a dozen times in Sicily with him, yeah. There was Etna behind the stage and the full moon rose. It was just beautiful. I remember that, yeah. Sometimes in Ubu, we are playing a song very, very tight. And then at other times, it's completely free. So it's that combination, and I like that combination because you've got a mixture of the strict discipline of the song and the total freedom of the improvisation. We did one tour where we were our own support act. So we would come on for half an hour and do complete free improvisation, go off for 10 minutes, come back and play tight songs. And what we were doing in the free improvisation was really writing the next album through free improvisation. David challenges you. And if you come up to the challenge, then you're there, then you're safe with him. If you don't, goodbye, yeah. It has to be said, you know, I spent 7 years with Nico and I spent 10 years or more with David. They're not the easiest people. You know, they're difficult people in some ways. They challenge you. It's not safe. I like that feeling of everything could go wrong. It could be a disaster. I like that feeling. I've had a few opportunities in my life to play in sort of safer pop bands, and I got bored in a few weeks. You know, it's just no good. It's not for me, really, yeah. I described the band Infidel that I went to Siberia with. Well, after we'd been in Russia, I came back and I wanted to do a solo project. And because I was very influenced by going to Russia, I chose Yuri Gagarin as the name of my solo project. I've never been able to choose to this day. I love the ambient stuff, but as a drummer, I like beats and I like pulse. So really, I've spent the last 25 years fighting those two things and fighting to put them together, really. I find I'm not good at making out and out four on the floor dance music. You know, Justin from Now is brilliant at it. He can just do that. I can't do that thing. I don't know why. But if I do pure ambient, I get a bit bored and I need some beats. So I just need that combination, really, yeah. There are key themes in what I do, which is I use a lot of environmental sound, recorded in nature or recorded in the city. I use a lot of that. There is always melody, and the emotion of melody is always key to me. I wouldn't say there's a message. It's about what people find in it for themselves, really, because it's quite abstract. Because there's no words, I think people can interpret the music how they want to interpret it. You know, the last 20 years has just flown by doing similar stuff, really. You know, I've kept Gagarin going. I've been in Pere Ubu. I met Roshi, and we formed a band, Roshi featuring Pars Radio, to do some Iranian folk pop music. And at the same time, I've kind of developed a career as a community musician, where I work with disabled kids through music. So that's my kind of day job, is I go to schools and I work with disabled kids and kids with learning difference. And I become a lecturer at Goldsmiths, University of London as well. It's kind of half my life is what you could call teaching. I call it community music. And the other half is the performing and composing, really. So sometimes I might play a gig with Pere Ubu on a Saturday night. And on a Monday morning, I'll be on the floor with a bunch of disabled 5-year-olds, and I'm doing the same stuff. I'm improvising, I'm listening, I'm playing, I'm interacting, I'm using the same skills, and it feels just the same. And I absolutely love that.